All right then, so basically by way of wrap up, we're going to go back to the piece from Arthur Murphy that we had at the very beginning. We didn't quite deal with the last few pages. That's what we'll emphasize here. Basically, we've talked about Rorty, talked about Harding. We're just going to make some connections with Murphy, basically. Some of that we'll go back over in the review for the exam. And then at the end here, I'm just going to make some reference to some ideas pertaining to our current situation, well, in particular in this country, although it applies elsewhere as well. So the slides that I have here, hang on. Slides that I have here, these are kind of the same as before, so I'll go really fast through the first half dozen or so slides because we did those at the beginning. Basically, this was kind of the breakdown of his article. You'll remember basically how he was talking about philosophy in terms of the philosophical mind. He started what is not. That's the ordinary rules. This is probably ringing some bells. Nor is it just some certain view that might be deemed to be correct in a certain society. Actually, you can see there's certain relevance there with Rorty. And he goes on about that. It's all mainly, you remember, about really this quite strong emphasis on the importance of everyone kind of thinking for themselves, thinking critically, being prepared and motivated to do that. Kind of along the lines of, well, if you don't do your own thinking, there's always somebody who's quite prepared to do it for you. So this was kind of the 5 qualities you remember he talked about. I'm not going to necessarily run through all of those right now. You can go back and remind yourself about those if you like, and you should in fact do that. I think we wrapped it up around this point before, basically, when we're talking about this kind of fundamental thing that philosophers do in Murphy's view. I would largely agree as well in terms of trying to draw this distinction between appearance and reality, what seems to be real and what really is real, to try to draw that distinction as best we can, as clearly and self-consciously as we can. And remember, the idea is that some such distinction typically is always kind of operating in our minds. It typically operates in different fields of science as well, but typically on a taken-for-granted basis. Whereas here in philosophy, we really take it up directly, self-consciously, and really think about it. And that's where we come to realize, of course, it can be answered in different ways, and it's not at all obvious, which is, say, the best answer to give. And yet we can't really get by without an answer. So this is kind of where we pick up. This is the last few pages I don't think we talked about earlier in the semester, basically, just about why this is so important. He takes a big step back, basically. Right up to this point, you could say that, sure, having a philosophical mind is probably a good thing. Anybody in particular might be better off for it, whatever. But here he wants to say it actually has much broader significance, a much broader value kind of for society, for a democratic society in particular. You'll notice he plays on a certain, actually a spelling mistake a student once made between peace of mind spelled that way and peace of mind spelled that way. And he thought that was really quite telling. I mean, the idea, what we really want. And remember, this is from the Cold War. People were really, yearning for a more sustainable peace. It's kind of expressed here as peace of mind, sense of security, crucial for any kind of human existence. You don't want to live in a situation of tension or potential conflict with your neighbors or in a global context. But he basically was thinking that so many people at that time were not intellectually prepared to really do what was necessary to make that a reality. Basically, people were afraid of other ideas. They did not engage. They did not think productively about how to deal with the situation. At the time, it was communism in the USSR that was the issue. And Murphy, has very harsh words for these people. He's not telling anybody to agree with them, of course. He's just saying, they're just retreating from the challenge. And that's what all of those harsh terms like poverty of spirit or simple-mindedness and so on, that's what he's talking about. As opposed to the philosophical mind, which is, in his view of things, just expressly oriented to some kind of higher level. Notice he never really talks about objectivity, and it's probably fair to say he's not, say, guilty of falling for the illusion of that traditional ideal. He just wants to say, well, we could do better, right? We could try to kind of work out a mutual understanding with others that can include both sides, kind of at a higher level, and hopefully therefore avoid any potential problems or conflicts or whatever, third world wars, basically. So he had more of a focus kind of on the international community, but you could think about something similar within the domestic context as well. But basically just sort of aiming for something new, try to work out or try to kind of forge a new understanding that different sides could all take part in, basically, as opposed to different sides just kind of turning their backs on one another, turning inwards, just falling on their old familiar habits of thought and then seeing what happens. But Murphy seems to think it's quite likely that what's going to happen is not going to be good for anybody. He's perfectly aware, basically, very much aware, I think, that this can seem sort of idealistic in the negative sense that people might use that word, that it wasn't very practical, that surely, serious real-world problems required a more practical approach. But his point seems to be, no, actually, when the problems get this big, right, then you definitely need a different intellectual frame of mind, something that is oriented to, kind of bringing into being a genuinely new solution. The problems are new, the solution needs to be new. So those people who typically think they're being more practical are basically just really short-sighted, right? And Murphy's point is that short-sighted solutions here will just never work, right? The problems are big. We need a much broader vision, and that's the kind of thing that a philosophical mind has to offer. It's a long quote here. It's really quite lovely to read, basically, but really just emphasizing these themes. You can see some of the words, right, about sanity and courage, not being afraid to do this, a sense of maturity, basically, all of these things that he associates with a philosophical response to these large-scale challenges, basically. He really thinks anything else is really a kind of a pathetic retreat or a surrender, or just a failure to see what's really at issue and what needs to be done. So the way he kind of wraps up, he has this, it's not the final line, but it's quite near the end. He basically just poses a kind of choice. He says, there are these two different options, different shades in between, no doubt, but you have on the one side, the thing he's so critical of, this narrow, non-philosophical perspective. Or, on the other hand, the full acceptance of our intellectual and moral responsibilities. Well, that's, of course, what he means by the philosophical mind. Clearly, he's definitely pushing us in that direction. But still, it's a choice, right? He's not saying anybody has to do anything. You just try to see things how they are and make a judgment as to what might be the most appropriate response. So I don't want to focus a lot on that, but just for now try to relate it to what we've looked at with Harding and Rorty, with regard to the question of objectivity, because there seem to be a lot of interesting connections that we could see there. Everybody here is basically throwing this big choice at us, basically. Rorty's saying solidarity or objectivity. Harding is saying weak or strong objectivity. Murphy here had been saying, this or that, non-philosophical or a philosophical mind. So it could be quite interesting just to see how these things line up. For now, I'm just going to give some general points here. Fairly small text, but, some points like this. That on the one hand, or to begin with, right, what Murphy is talking about, does in some ways look like the choice. Choice here in the sense of the two options put forward. It looks like the choice put forward by Rorty, basically a kind of more limited, domestic perspective, inward looking, as opposed to a more, say, outward looking in the global context, basically, for the right way to understand our situation in terms of making sense of things, basically. So that seems fairly similar, that sets of options. Of course, the difference, let me just put all these points up, actually. The difference, of course, is that the choice that they each make are completely different, right? Rorty is going for the ethnocentric, the more limited, kind of narrow perspective, exactly what Murphy seems so critical of, basically, right? And that goes along with this more limited sense of we being this community, not sort of identifying or, say, feeling any solidarity with a global community. Whereas that definitely seems, at least implicit in what Murphy's saying. He's definitely saying we need to kind of orient ourselves, understand that at least at some level we're all in the same boat, and we've got to figure out a way to get along and kind of understand one another. Basically, with Rorty, there's nothing there that would help us do that. We can only really turn away from that problem. Or, in effect, really, Rorty's saying that's exactly the kind of problem we should ignore, basically. So basically, Murphy and Rorty go their separate ways without it being the case, as I mentioned before, that Murphy isn't necessarily doing what Rorty is so opposed to. He's not necessarily saying that the solution he's looking for is to discover the truly objective answer to anything, or nothing like that. He's just kind of saying we could, if we so desire, and if others on the other side likewise so desire, work out a new kind of mutual understanding. So in that regard, it seems a lot more like Harding and her account of strong objectivity, right? A kind of a better view, a more inclusive view, which we might think as being more epistemically just, potentially, right? That seems to be the kind of thing. Neither of them are thinking that we're just sort of discovering the truly correct objective answer to the questions we're asking, but we can kind of work out a new understanding of things that might be able to bridge over some of the divisions or tensions which threaten our well-being. So it's definitely, it seems like Murphy and Harding are more on the same wavelength and Rorty is on the other side. That doesn't make him wrong or anything. It's just to say, understanding these views, there's probably a much greater affinity between Murphy and Harding than between either of those and Rorty. I've noted here, of course, that nothing will ever happen if, this is not desired on both sides, basically. There has to be a kind of collective will for that ever to happen. One side can't just do it alone or impose it on the other. That would be like the problem of objectivity. Basically, the difference you could think about is just in terms of something like community or a collectivity. When you ask yourself about yourself, who you are, to what we does one belong? I mean, it's a deep question and it's worth thinking about carefully and so on, but you can think about it like this, just whose views count for you, you might say, whose views count and whether that matters, Up to a point, it's probably okay when not everybody's matter to you on every single question. Something like that is fairly normal. But at some point, with some questions, it must cross over into a kind of injustice. And the question is really just to be attentive to that. Just try to think, which community, how broad it is. So when we think about Murphy, it's, something really at a global level ought to kind of take precedence, at least with large-scale questions like that. That's kind of the same thing, I think, when Harding, even if she's talking about the domestic context in this or that society, it's sort of the same idea, sort of asking us to take the perspective of the whole, even if it is currently characterized by some divisions and so on, but exactly in order to try to overcome those. Whereas with Rorty, it just tends to be more the case that we're just left with those divisions, and we just sort of take them as given, as drawing lines between different communities, each of which is basically supposed to go its own way. Anyways, I'm going to wrap this up here and make a short further one about the next few slides, basically, which really kind of take these ideas and just show how they might apply to our current situation here in this country.